Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure today to interview another author. In this case, it happens to be my son, Ben Moskalensky, who has a new book out called The Hawker's Memoirs. Let's say hello to Ben. Hi, Ben.
Hello.
And so I guess we'll start with some questions. I'll be doing the interviewing, and Ben will be doing the answering. So my first question, Ben, is tell people who may not know you a little bit about you.
I mean, I'm just an author, come from Washington State, live in Washington State. I just write books for fun. It's a really kind of interesting thing for me. I like to put a fair amount of hours a day into it. I just came across writing as something I really enjoyed. I read a lot of other good books by a lot of other good people, like Brandon Sanderson, Greg Hurwitz, Mark Greene, a lot of these other authors I really enjoyed to read, and I wanted to put some of my own ideas that I had always just thought about. I wanted to put them in a physical form, and I wanted people to be able to enjoy them just as much as I had thinking about them and then writing them.
Okay, and so you're going to be going to tell people where you're at in school and everything.
I've recently graduated from the 7th grade, so trying to survive school here just like everyone else. I go to normal school, normal area. I'm not exactly going to any sort of big fancy writer school, but it's just, yeah, I just came across it. I don't really know any other child authors, but that's not really, although it would be cool, not discouraging me.
Okay, so anyway, since I know the author, I guess I could add a little bit more of my own information here. So yeah, so Ben initially started doing some. He actually put together a YouTube channel for him back when he was 8, and he started doing these shows about describing various kids' TV shows, and we did some of the episodes of YouTube shows that we played some music together and reviewed some movies we saw, and so Ben was basically fairly involved in the whole YouTube spectrum, and he's still doing quite a bit of stuff on YouTube. But probably I would say about what, couple of years when you started writing the books? Was it a couple of years ago?
I started writing. I remember it was right after Christmas of 2015. So
okay, so yeah, so 2 years ago basically, and maybe a little bit less. And so he wrote this first book, which was just a huge monstrosity. And as anything, first it wasn't exactly stellar, but at the same time, it gave him kind of enough to get a feel for writing. And like he was saying, he got into it and he started doing it more and more. A lot of times now, I would ask him, do you want to go watch some TV? And he would say, no, I think I'm going to go upstairs and write some more. So he really seems to enjoy it, and had published already several books on Amazon. He's doing the self-publishing, and so moving on. So that's pretty much about Ben. Let's move on to the actual this particular book. So the book is called The Hawker's Memoirs, and the subtitle is The Ghost Story, right?
The Ghost of Nothing.
The Ghost of Nothing. Sorry, my bad. So for those who want to check out the book, yeah, if you just jump to Amazon, the cover looks like this. It's easily recognizable if you type in the name, and you can pick one up. It's pretty cheap right now for only $3.99. But getting back to the book, so tell us a little bit about the history of this particular book, and why did you decide to write this particular book?
Well, at this point, I had just finished my journal of the first book in my Journal of the Survivor series, which I'm actually going to be starting on the sequel very soon after I'm done with this current book I'm working on. And I realized I wanted to try something kind of similar, but without the sci-fi elements. And at the time, I was also very excited about history, so I wanted to do a lot of research regarding history. So I decided I would do a historical fiction book taking place in the year 1694 to 1695, but still a first-person perspective. And as for the particular idea of Hawker's memoirs, I kind of got it. The way I do it is I typically like to come up with some general ideas that I'm really excited about at the time. Like at that point, I was very excited about history. So I was asking people about different time eras in history and like what I could do with them. And the one that won out was the late 17th century French kind of general era. So that's what I decided to go with. And and for this particular book, I had a much darker kind of a feeling in mind, but not to the point where it becomes like modern Batman comics, where it's just so dark that it just completely spans off of what I like doing. So Hawker's memoirs was kind of like, it had a very similar process to most of my books, where I like to ask people. I come up with my own ideas and I ask people to narrow it down, and then I work from there.
Okay, but let's step back a little bit. You mentioned something about that this was darker book than some of your other books and stuff like that. Some people may not be familiar with your other books. So tell us a little bit about what kind of genre of books you're usually writing, and more specifically, your prior books. Just really briefly about each book you had and kind of, what they were about.
Well, my very first book was Saras Stories. This was a third-person book, also fantasy, but not really historical. And it had the kind of I sort of kept that level of maturity throughout my other books, which is sort of around ages of 9, like a bit younger than me to a bit older than me, like 9 to 13 or 9 to 14. That was kind of the aging I envisioned. And the same thing applies to, well, my next book was more of it was more of an offshoot from the first book, The Official Guide from Mortal to Vampire, which was my second book. It was more of like one of those factual books regarding the first book, all about the history of vampires and stuff. And like the culture and all that sort of stuff. Then my third book, The Journal of the Survivor, this was a more sci-fi book, but again with the same general feeling of this is a book that pretty much any age, more in the in-between kind of years, would be good with reading. So they all had a very similar feel in terms of style of writing, like language and maturity. Not quite to the point where it's some super spy novel, but not as immature as, say, a fairy tale.
But what were they about? Can you tell us a little bit more about the stories themselves? I mean, were they set in the future, in the past? Are they
stories?
Realistic? I mean, you said that one of them was fantasy, or more than one even. And so if it's fantasy, then you can have all kinds of things going on. So, fill people in a little bit more about the other books.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first book, Saras Stories, this was one thing about all my books is they always take place in the same universe. What I mean by that is, sorry, I got a bit of allergies, is even though it might be different time eras and some of the deals might not interlap, like some of the different characters may never interlap, all of my books will take place in the same universe. Like Hawker's memoirs is just before Journal of the Survivor, and although they have nothing to do with each other, maybe someday I'll do something related to that. But like Saras Stories, as an example, is the very starting part of that. And it was basically third-person book in the late 6th century about a dark elf named Sarah, who is branching away from her kingdom of dark elves after she lived in a very enclosed kind of lifestyle, if you will, and now that she's like out in the world, she's been separated from the rest of her team. She realizes like she needs to start fighting against her people, which are the dark elves, and then things go from there. There's the whole deal with the rest of her people being dark elves and all kinds of relationships with other races, the other races of that fictional world.
So definitely fantasy. Okay, and then the other books?
Yes, and again, vampires, as I like to call it, shortened. That's just an offshoot of Saras stories, more of an informational text regarding it, which is more for anybody who really enjoyed it, not really a book by itself. Now, Journal of the Survivor was pretty much sci-fi, because you can't really, unless your sci-fi is very modern, like takes place in modern times, it's kind of hard to do very realistic sci-fi. But basically, Journal of the Survivor, it takes place in the year 2209, at least the first one does, 42 years after a third world war, which, and that war, pretty much nobody wins. There's a whole backstory with the war, which we do not have time to get into. I'm actually going to be writing an entire separate book on that after I finish Journal of the Survivor too. But after this war, pretty much no one wins, and the world does whatever it can to survive while the radiation clears in the air. And what America did, and a lot of other countries, they created these things called safes, which are like these underground bunkers, if you will, which overall stored up to 1% of the population of the state. And one of that 1%, or the daughter of one of that 1%, is Hannah Holloway, the main character and the author of this first-person book. And it basically talks about, for reasons I will not get into due to massive spoilers, she is forced to leave her safe, and she is forced to go out into the world. And there's just all sorts of things wrong with the world, and everything is far, far different than from, 42 years ago. And it starts out, she's just trying to find her dad. She just wants to go back to her safe, wants to find her dad, wants to clear the air. But over time, she sees how like that just becomes less and less likely, and events lead to certain events. And there are just so many different parts of Journal Survivor, because it was a 638-page book, and that's just the first part of it. So again, I'm not going to get into too many details, but that's the basic premise.
Okay, so then let's move on to Hawker's memoirs. And so what is Hawker's memoirs about, and how is it different in terms of the story and the concept and things like that?
Well, actually, it would probably be better to do what's similar, because Hawker's memoirs, I tried to branch off very much from Hawker's memoirs. First of all, from the perspective of Hannah Holloway, the main character of Journal of Survivor, she's like this innocent little 9-year-old girl who just wants to pretty much stay safe, or at least that's how it starts out. Hawker's memoirs is written from an aristocratic, somewhat aristocratic, but also very deadly Frenchman named Nicholas Rome. And by the way, that's not a spoiler. If you scroll down to the first sentence, it literally says, my name is Nicholas Rome, and these are my memoirs. Or Nicholas Rome is my name, and these are my memoirs. And it basically talks about the story, again, fictional, of Nicholas Rome and his very small team, as they take assignments from King Louis XIV, who was the real king of France at the time. And they travel across the world doing different deeds, kind of like Black Ops. It was sort of like early modern history Black Ops, and talks about all these different operations throughout the world. Like some of it is related to just stuff I totally made up, like the Russian mafia at the time, kind of mafia, involved with the British and the whole cigarettes thing, which I totally made up. And a lot of it had to do with French and Ottoman relations at the time, which were very complicated due to the Great Turkish War. A lot of that stuff was extremely realistic. So it is much more historical than my past attempts at history, being the Official Guide for Mortal Vampires and Saras Stories. There are a lot of historical elements in the Hawker's memoirs, but it still is fantasy. Like, it has dragons. And if Nicholas Rome was real, then I had no idea. It was a character that I totally came up with, as are his partners.
Would you classify it as a spy type book, or what genre would you give it outside of fantasy if you were gonna describe it?
Could I narrow it down to 3?
Yeah, fine.
Spy, I think, is actually a perfect term for it, because it does have a lot of that sort of stuff in it. Like, there's a lot of investigation going on. There are some criminal cases, all that sort of stuff. And he's extremely astute. That's one of the things, because he's very high up on the chain of command, Nicholas Rome. But I'd use that term. I'd use fantasy, spy, fantasy, and historical, because a huge part of this, I did an insane amount of research. I'm talking, sometimes it would take multiple hours to write multiple paragraphs. I mean, I would have to do so much research because I did want to make this more realistic than any book I'd made. And same with the darkness level. Like, I would not recommend this book to anybody below the age of 11. And only like extremely mature 11-year-olds, because I don't go to the point where it's practically a rated R movie turned book. It's not like The Killing Joke is an example. But there are some like more gory moments than I would have in, say, Journal of the Survivor. And it has a generally just much darker feeling to it.
Sounds like the next Game of Thrones to me.
Exactly. Something like that. But from everything I've heard about the Red Wedding, I don't think this quite stands up to that legacy.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, so now that we're gonna have an understanding of what this book is about, tell us a little bit where you came up with the concept for the story itself and the characters. You know, what are the backgrounds there? I mean, how did you come up with this stuff?
Well, one thing I wanted to do is, with my specific time era, I wanted to be unique in terms of, the first thing I always like to do with my books is choose the time era. I know that sounds kind of interesting, but it's actually a really good, since so far I'm only doing sci-fi and fantasy, it's actually a really good baseline for me, because I already have a lot of my universe in like different timelines. I already have a lot of it constructed. So coming up with a general timeline of when the book takes place is actually much better for me. And I did want to do it in France. I'm not sure exactly why. I kept thinking about, wouldn't it be cool if it was heavily revolving around France and Europe at the time. And France, of course, still is, and definitely was at that time era, a cultural point in the world, extremely relevant. But so many books focus on like either eras when they didn't have as many cool weapons and inventions, like pre-mid 15th century, or they focus on very famous eras like mid 20th century, or just 20th century in general, or mid to late 19th century with like the French Revolution. I wanted to pick an era which had famous figures, like the late 17th century, which had many famous kings, emperors, czars, etc. But I didn't want to pick something that had just been done to death, like the French Revolution. Henceforth, the idea of a late 17th century France, since I'm a big fan of the History Channel. I had just seen a documentary on King Louis XIV, and I was just ready. No, it was an article. I just finished reading an article about King Louis XIV, and I was just so fascinated that I just felt like, yeah, this has to be on the poll.
Gotcha. And then, so it's called, you know, Hawker's Memoirs, The Ghost of Nothing. What's this reference to? The Ghost of Nothing.
Well, a big part of the
Without spoilers, hopefully.
Yeah, it won't be. Neither explanation for the name of the series, which is Hawker's Memoirs, and the specific name of this book, which is The Ghost of Nothing, neither of these involve spoilers. So, The Ghost of Nothing, a very big part of this book revolves around the fact that Nicholas Rome, in most circles, is pretty much a ghost, if you will. I mean, even though he's very high in the French ranks, and again, it's actually a spoiler if I tell you where, because that's a pretty important thing later on in the book. Chapter 7, if anyone's wondering, where you find out why that's the case. But the whole thing about Nicholas Rome is he's pretty much a ghost. And for some reason, we can't see your face right now. Right. You're still showing the book right now, just so you know. But throughout the entire book, the entirety of the book, he tries to remain a very private figure. He's a quiet person, and he's a very quiet figure. But what he actually does goes very, very much so seen, unlike himself. Like he's not exactly doing community service. Like assassinations of high-level people. He sometimes works as bodyguard, sometimes solves murders, like he can work as a detective. all these different things. He works on very high level cases, and that's kind of the point. All these different things get done, but people don't. The majority of people, public and even somewhat private, do not know who he is. So he is. That's why he's the ghost of nothing, because you don't know who he is or what he's done. You just know that something's been done. That's why he's the ghost of nothing.
Gotcha. And is the plan to have additional Hawker's Memoirs books? Is this just the first of the series, or what's the plan there?
It is actually supposed to be a duology, but I'm kind of split, because on one hand, I have a perfect ending for Hawker's Memoirs 2, which I believe is the last one. So my current plan right now is at some point I'll do Hawker's Memoirs Book 2, and then, unless there's very popular demand, that will be it. After Hawker's Memoirs Book 2 is out and published, unless there's popular demand for a Hawker's Memoirs 3, which I could make work. I think I have some ideas. I could make that work, but not necessarily. I could go either way in a Hawker's Memoirs 3. But with the Hawker's Memoirs, it most likely, unless there's very popular demand to return the series, that would most likely be its end after Book 2. With no spin, I don't think.
And officially, we are open to movie producers and stuff like that for movie rights.
Oh, totally, no problem.
Okay, so speaking of high demand, low demand, how has this book been received by people who had a chance to read it? I mean, I realize it just came out, but people who have read it, have you had any feedback from people?
Yes, actually, I've had a good amount of feedback. Not quite as much as I had on Journal of the Survivor, which by far got the most, but that's because I had the most going on with that series, since it was much
longer.
This
just came out anyway. I mean, it's just
that as well,
deal, so,
right?
Yeah.
Hawker's Memoir or Journal of Survivor has been available much longer. But from what I've heard from Hawker's Memoirs, people say that in general, what they are seeing from Hawker's Memoirs is they'd say or at the time when I heard from them, they said it was worth buying, and I'm still trying to get in contact with some people about that. But they said it seemed like a very interesting concept. But I got so many fascinating ideas and historical facts from people and different ideas that, I mean, I want to say almost a quarter of the book, I got at least some influence from fans and supporters of the series, because so many people were just flooding me with ideas. So I think it's a kind of deal where, with what I have currently, I'm doing good, but there's a lot of untapped potential, and I'm really trying to look into that.
Yeah, but people have received it fairly positively so far.
Yes, for the most part. It's kind of interesting with Hawker's Memoirs, because so far everyone I've talked to, I've had no meh opinions. It's either this is horrible or this is really good. I haven't really had an in-between opinion as of yet from anybody. On Amazon, we have a review, and it's a spam review, I believe. If you check out the review, do you have it available right now?
Yeah. I wouldn't call it a review. I would just call it somebody doing something because they can, because they don't have anything better to do. I wouldn't call it the review exactly.
Right.
But yeah, somebody left one-line deal that says, Amazon did not let me get this book because he had, period. I more hard copies, so if I could, I would give it 0 stars. 0 stars. So not only is this person incapable of spelling, nor do they speak English. The title of this supposed review was called Don't Get, and he put in 1 star. So clearly, the guy is I don't want to say it in public here, but not anybody who read the book, considering this came out the very first day and when the book was published and stuff. So, it's I wouldn't even call it a review. But other than that, what have you heard from other people?
Well, obviously, I mean, some of my opinions I get have been biased. I remember I went to go talk to my aunt about this book, and I hadn't even showed it to her yet when she said, "Looks great, Benny." So obviously, what some people tell me is beyond biased, but I have gotten some genuine critiques from people online who I had never met, who said, who gave it, I'd say the average of what people have given it is 4 stars, approximately 4 stars out of 5-ish. Because it's there, I have made mistakes, and I am very clear on that. Like there have definitely been some parts of the book I could have done better. And like, you know, sometimes the writing isn't as good as it could have been and so on, but people say overall it is an enjoyable book. That's what I've heard. And like some of this historical stuff is really interesting to them. And honestly, you read the point of this book was, again, not to be too horribly mature. I'll bet you if I would have really wanted to be mature, it would not be done by now. I would have to work much, much longer on it to get an even higher standard of writing, because that's another key difference between my past books and this book. My past books are written very formally. Like, let's look at Journal of the Survivor as an example. It's written from the perspective of a 9-year-old girl who talks like a normal 9-year-old girl. Just very normal. But this is very like high-end English. And funny enough, I started working on Hawker's memoirs around the time, and this is actually one of the reasons I was also keen on doing Hawker's memoirs, was to do my Justin Cronin impression. And if you guys are looking for a fantastic author, just look up Justin Cronin. His viral series is just beyond amazing, and he's just such a master of English. I can't even begin to try. Some of my best statements in that book kind of come up to par with some of his average statements. And honestly, I'm proud of myself even for that. But yeah, that's one thing I do like to do, is I do like to get a fair amount of influence from other people, but not to the point where it just overrides my own feelings on the subject. Like, even if I do get a generally good review, even like in the comments of one of my little parts that I post publicly, and it says something like, this is really good, but why don't you try XX? And I just personally don't like the idea. I'm not going to go with it just because it makes sense and a lot of other people like it, because it's still my book in the end.
That's true. So, well, you know, as we wrap up here, just wanted to ask you, what are your near-term plans in terms of books? And then also, oh yeah, before we get into that, so what age group specifically, because you kind of touched on it, but you didn't really specify, you know, would you recommend this book only to the, let's say, young teens to read, about your age and a little bit older? Would you recommend it to adults? I mean, what is your personal recommendation in terms of who might be most interested in reading something like Hawker's memoirs?
That's a great question, actually, because it can vary. I mean, I would not recommend it to literally anybody under the age of 11, and if you're 11, only if you're like very mature, for someone of your age. Because let's say you're reading this with a friend or a family member or something like that. Some of the battle moments, or some of the judgment moments by some of the characters. Again, I don't want to get into what a judgment moment is, but you will see if you buy Hawker's memoirs. That's a big spoiler. But like some of the moments in there could it would not be good for someone who is just not used to that kind of stuff. Like someone say of the age of 6. I mean, I can't, just do not under any circumstances let someone of that age read this book.
No, okay, so you already said 11. Let's not, drill too much.
But as for going upwards, I don't really think there's a maximum. I mean, I think if you're like 30, you wouldn't really enjoy reading this book. Because I'm still a kid's author, because I'm a kid. It's still meant to be a kid's deal, but I'd say 11 to teen, like any point in the teens, be it 13 to 14 to 15 to 18. I mean, anything like that, really.
Okay. All right. And then, so like I said, what are the near-term plans in terms of writing?
Well, I typically like to think of my next 3 books in advance, but not go too much farther. Because I used to have that problem where I'd think so far in the future and get so excited that I wouldn't really focus on what I'm doing now and just kind of drop off from everything. So I'm kind of keeping a chain on myself, if you will, no farther than 3 books planning in the future. right now I'm working on my kids' book, recommended ages 6 to 8, which should be published in a week or two here. The Hero of the First Islands. Then afterwards, I'm going to be writing Journal of the Survivor 2. And if I go into the plot of that, that'll be a huge spoiler for Journal of the Survivor 1. So that'll be its own separate HOA as well. After that, I'm going to do what I talked about earlier, which is the kind of spin-off, if you will, the one-time spin-off of Journal of the Survivor, which explains the origins of the Third World War and all these characters that you know about and a bunch of characters you don't know about, and kind of how it all connects from a third person's perspective. And after that's done, I'm going to be working on Journal of the Survivor 3, because people really wanted Journal of the Survivor, I guess. After that, I have no idea. I'm only going to even start getting into my next book, even just basic scratch line ideas, once I even start working on Journal of the Survivor 2. So I'm not worrying about that for now.
Yeah, no, I'm not worried about either. We do want to have the 4.0 GPA staying in place, so as you move forward through school. All right, so we'll wrap it up. I guess the last thing is, again, I want to point out that people can go to Amazon.com and pull up the Hawkers memoirs book, available right now, and check it out. And then if you like the book, or if you don't like the book, whatever the case may be, feel free to leave a normal review, actual review. We certainly appreciate reviews on Amazon. And I'll let you finish up, Ben, with a couple of words, and we'll wrap it up.
All right. But yeah, real quick to go back to the review thing. Even if you don't like it, I would still appreciate your review and your genuine criticism. The reason I got so mad about this review was I have never worked this hard on anything accumulative in my life, not something that like has a grand result. I think I've put more work into Hawker's memoirs than anything else in my life, and it's not even like a genuine criticism saying like the characters were disinteresting, the quality of writing was bad, nothing like that. It was just some spam review from some idiot online who thought it would be funny to just completely tarnish
because they could. Yeah, it's not because who knows what they thought, so they didn't think. But yeah, we definitely, you know, the bottom line is it wasn't really a review. Like I said, it was published. The post was published the very first day the book came out. So, you know, how big is this book, Ben? How many pages?
It is a 280-page exactly book.
Yeah, so it's hard to believe that somebody actually sat down in a matter of a couple of hours, read 280 pages, and wrote this imbecilic line. But anyway, that's not what we're talking about here. So,
and besides, there's no verified buyer tag as well.
Anything else before we wrap up, or are we done?
One final thing. I know I kept talking about online involvement, and I wasn't kidding about that. On my Google Plus, on my Google Plus account, which is just Ben Moskalensky, and there are actually several spam accounts as well. So you gotta look for the one that isn't like just rotting away, with the one with fresh posts. You can go to some of my collections, and I named them after my books. Like I have a Journal of the Survivor Florida collection, a Hawker's Memoirs Goes to Nothing. So each time I make a book, I have a collection on it, and I just write and repost everything about that book on those collections. And that's where I post all my polls about where the next book should be and any news whatsoever, including any hints and tidbits or parts of the book that come out for public consumption. So if anybody would like to go see the book while it's being written, pretty much, and get the first draft 100% for free permanently, or at least parts of the first draft, you can go onto Google Plus. The only way you can get the final finished 100% version of the book is to buy it on Amazon once it comes out. Great. And I think that'll do it.
Excellent. Thank you very much for taking the time today.
Thank you.
If you would like to get in touch with Ben, again, the name is Ben Moskalensky. You can find him on Google Plus easily. You can find him on Instagram. You can contact him through me. There's all kinds of different ways to contact. And Thank you very much for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.